Yeah. Especially since we're going to put this on YouTube. That would be great. That would be great.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Your attendance and book purchases help us have these sort of moments, and we're so excited today to welcome Emel Rio, presenting her new novella, Graveyard Shift, with Daniel Wallace. Emel Rio is the author of international bestseller If We Were Villains, which has been published in 20 countries and 18 languages. Graveyard Shift is her first novella. Daniel Wallace is the author of 6 novels, including Big Fish, which was adapted and released as a movie and a Broadway musical. He is the J. Ross McDonald Distinguished Professor of English at UNC Chapel Hill. We hope you enjoyed the event. We do have more copies of Graveyard Shift, If We Were Villains, and Daniel's most recent release up front, if anyone wants to get any more after the talk. We're also going to have a signing at the finish of the talk at the back of the room at that black table. So I'll help y'all queue up after the talk. But photos are great so feel free to take pictures during this conversation. We will ask that you don't take pictures during the signing line, just so we keep things moving through. But yeah, looking forward to it, and we'll see y'all then. But first, Emel Rio and Daniel Wallace.
Thank you. I wonder, do you think we'll need these?
Do we need these?
What do you want? Do you want with or without?
Do we need these? No?
No? Good. Delaney, what about it? Do you think we need them? I picked you because you're the farthest ears.
I can hear you.
Really? Gabe? Good, okay.
I was an actor in a former life. I'm loud.
And I'm just loud. Okay. So welcome everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And I know Emel's happy to be here too. We were here the last time when your book came out, your first novel came out, what year would that have been?
2017. Wow. Yeah.
And so we're making this tradition now. Every time she publishes something.
It's really just an excuse for me to hang out with Daniel. I published a book so we can hang out.
Exactly. That's the only way I get back to Alabama, where I'm from, is by publishing a book. Nobody wants to see me otherwise. So every time I go down there. So we're going to talk about a lot of things tonight, and I know we'll talk about even more things when Q&A comes around. But we're going to start talking about the new novella, Graveyard Shift, which is amazing on so many levels. I don't know if you've read it or not, but before we tackle the book itself, I want to talk about insomnia. Because writers have influences and make us who we are, write the things that we do, have influences, and sometimes they're writers, and sometimes they're where we go to school, people that we know. Insomnia, I feel like, is an influence that has affected you, and especially this book. So talk about insomnia for a second.
Oh, just for a second?
No, for 2 or 3 minutes at least.
Because I could talk about that all night. I won't, because that would be inflicting it on the rest of you. Yeah. I have always been a really terrible sleeper, and that's a weird thing to say, that like I'm bad at sleeping, which is a really basic human function. It's like saying I'm bad at breathing. But ever since I was a little kid, I had night terrors when I was young, and even when I was really little, I had a lot of trouble sleeping through the night, and my poor parents, who had 2 kids, were like, well, we have to sleep. So at a certain point, we've done all the sleep training and you're kind of on your own. And, I was a child of the 90s. We didn't have smartphones. I didn't have a computer. So when you're just awake for like 6 or 7 hours a day that no one else is awake, you got to find a way to fill that time. And if you don't have screen media, because again, it's 1995, books become a real lifeline. Mm-hmm. So my insomnia, I've often joked that my insomnia is kind of like both a curse and a superpower, because without it, I'm not sure that I would have realized that a writer was sort of what I was supposed to be, because I read books constantly. I was fortunate in that the house that we lived in North Carolina, because I grew up here, the house that we lived in, I had a closet with a light. And I had a basket of stuffed animals, and so what I used to do is I would sit in that basket of stuffed animals and just read books like all night long in my closet, to the point where I actually did once fall asleep in there, and my parents got up in the morning and I was just gone and they didn't know where I was. So I inadvertently kind of gave both of my parents a heart attack, like looking for me in the morning. But at a certain point, I kind of went, I've read all the books that I have, and reading didn't quite feel like enough anymore, and that was when I decided I wanted to try writing. And so that kind of became my pattern for many, many years, was I did whatever I was doing during the day, whether it was school or jobs or some combination of the two. And then in the kind of wee hours when I couldn't sleep was when I started writing. And that kind of liminal space between sleeping and waking is actually a really good space to work on fiction, because your brain can sort of expand after dark because there's not as many distractions, and I don't know, the borders of reality just feel a little less firm at that time of night. So as much as Insomnia has been a real struggle for me, it's also been something that's kind of enabled me to tap into a creative space. Yeah.
There's a great essay you wrote that I read in Lit Hub. I don't know if you wrote it for them or if they found it somewhere else and published about writing at night and how the dream world and the fictional world can collide and create beautiful, beautiful things. And I feel like that's kind of what happens in this book. It's very dreamlike in many ways, and the characters, well, I'll just tell you if you haven't read the book, it's Graveyard Shift. It refers in one way to all the characters in the book, 5 of them, who all have night shift. They all work on the night shift, and they meet in this cemetery to smoke cigarettes. That's another thing. In this little novella, more people smoke cigarettes than you have seen in years. Seriously, this has got to go see a doctor. I think you should. No, I mean, it's just, I mean, amazing. It made me want to have a cigarette.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's both. It's both things. So, all these people are on the night shift, and they meet at this cemetery where, you know, they talk and yak it up. Then something happens that's different, and this is, you know, that inciting incident that changes everything. There's a new hole in the cemetery, wasn't there before, an empty grave, and it begins this mystery that we spend the rest of the book untangling, but that's just part of what's happening in this book. Talk about influences. There's a lot of science in here, and something else that you know a thing or two about that you bring into your books. But it's also, for me at any rate, it's about friendship. And then all of your books really are about friendship. Talk about, I mean, that's a lot to talk about. You could just talk for the next 45 minutes about all that. But talk about where the book came from, first initial idea.
Oh, sure. So you're right. Everything I write is, this is a term that I've just made up because it's not like a real thing, but I sometimes describe myself as an ensemble writer, because I tend to get bored very quickly with a story that just has kind of like one main character. I don't know. I have trouble staying in anybody's head for that long. I don't even want to be in my own head for that long. And instead, I find it much more interesting and much more dynamic to have a bunch of different characters and different personalities kind of playing off each other. So that's something that's just sort of a feature across my work rather than a bug. And I love that you highlighted this sort of like, who is still smoking in 2024? Because that's really a point of bonding, actually, for these characters. It's this kind of like weirdly shameful habit, like no one still smokes in 2024. And this was partly based on, so when I was an undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm sure this policy is still in place, it may be even more stringent now, I don't know, because this was years ago, that you couldn't smoke within 100 feet of any campus building.
Right.
And this resulted in this very amusing thing that used to happen where people had figured out that there were like 2 places on campus that you could smoke that were 100 feet from any campus building, because it's UNC, like every building is a campus building. So one place is the flagpole on North Quad, so you'll always see a bunch of like desperate people like gasping for a cigarette on the flagpole. And my freshman year, I lived in Cobb Hall, which is the only year that I lived. Yeah?
The gazebo.
Oh, I can tell you some horror stories about Cobb. But I lived in Cobb, and it's right next to the old Chapel Hill Cemetery. And my first year, I had my first creative writing class with Marianne Ginger. And for some reason, it was in a biology building that was like 10 miles away on the wrong side of campus. So in order to get there, I figured out that the fastest way to go was through the cemetery. And I don't know, because I was raised Roman Catholic, or this is just the way I am, I have a very morbid inclination just in general. And as soon as I realized that cemetery was there, I went, oh, well, this is my new favorite place on campus. And so it was not just a place that I walked through, but it became the place where I ate my lunch in the gazebo. And when I couldn't sleep, because I often can't, sometimes I would just go and hang out in the cemetery in the middle of the night, which I'm realizing as I say it out loud makes me sound like a serial killer, but it was mostly just that it was a place that was kind of quiet and still and very peaceful. And when you can't sleep, sometimes for days on end, everything starts to feel very overstimulating because all your defenses are just very, very low. And there was something sort of soothing about being in a place that I knew was going to be quiet and still. And even if I couldn't sleep, I could sort of approximate that experience by being surrounded by dead people, which is a little bit morbid, but you know, that was what it was. And I did occasionally run into people who were like smoking cigarettes in the cemetery in the middle of the night. And I went, oh, what a great place for that. Because who else is going to be wandering through here besides me at midnight? And so that idea just sort of took hold, and I went, okay, like this administrative or bureaucratic campus smoking policy would create these unlikely friendships between people who are just going to find themselves in the same place because that's where they have to be. And how much fun to give them a mystery to solve together, this kind of like unlikely band of misfits.
Right, absolutely. And you are an ensemble writer. That's a perfect description of what you do. But how hard is that, really? Because you have one main character. You just have, really, that's your responsibility. You really have to create a life, a place, everything about them. But you really, since you don't have a main character, you have 5 main characters. You have to create lives, backgrounds, places, everything about them. You like that?
I do. I really enjoy that. I find it a really delicious challenge, and I think part of it comes from I was sort of raised in the theater in addition to being raised in Chapel Hill and raised in Catholicism. Yikes. I was a theater kid from a very young age, so I was used to always being part of an ensemble and really liked that kind of close-knit group of friends. And you know, theater is interesting because it always kind of feels like a crisis, even when it's not. So there's a lot of trauma bonding that happens with theater kids. I hear some laughing, which makes me think that there are probably some theater people in here. And that's something that's kind of informed everything that I do. But it is definitely a challenge, and especially with a book this short.
Right.
And it's been funny, we've been seeing a lot of early reviews, and many of them are like, I'm mad that this isn't longer and it's not a novel. And in some ways I'm like, well, that's the best criticism you can ask for, is I wish this was longer. But that wasn't my decision. That was my publisher actually came to me and said, Barnes & Noble is interested in doing more novellas, and my first novel had been doing well for them, so they were curious if I was interested. And I also spent, 12 years working in higher education, where we love to talk about form and structure and all of those like really boring, dry things that can suck all the life out of a piece of art. But I love that kind of stuff. So I really like playing with form and structure. And I went, okay, a novella. I've never done that. And it was never something that I'd considered doing. But as soon as the opportunity kind of presented itself, I went, yeah, that sounds like a fun challenge. And then as soon as I started actually writing it, I realized how much of a challenge it is to tell a story in such a short space. Because the first question I had from my editor was, how many words can I have? Because typically, I don't know if you're the same way, typically my problem is overwriting. I tend to write too much and then have to cut way back. But I went into it knowing I only had 30,000 words. That's what they told me, is that's the upper limit, is 30,000 words. And just, for reference, a novel is usually like 80 to 100,000 words. So it's not even half a novel, it's like a third of a novel. And I sort of refused to compromise my determination to write an ensemble cast in such a short space. So once I started thinking about the structure, what I kind of landed on was I wanted it to feel like a relay. I wanted it to feel like a relay where one character kind of hands the story off to the next person at the end of each chapter. And at that point, I really just kind of crossed my fingers and hoped that I could bring 5 characters to life in such a short space.
I'm surprised that sentence was ever uttered. We want to sell more novellas.
I know.
Who has ever said that in their life? I mean, that's crazy. I mean, you don't read them that much anymore. They're very difficult for the reasons that you mentioned. How to not write a novel, not write a story, but that in-between space. And
I've had some interesting conversations with my publisher about why that is, about why BNN, which is, the biggest retail chain for books now, RIP Borders, why they were interested in actively pursuing novellas. And I think it's 2 things. The obvious answer is, we're the TikTok generation and everybody's attention span has shrunk to 30 seconds. I'm not actually on TikTok, so I'm just making stuff up here. But the other part of it is actually, it's super mundane, but it's supply chain issues. During the pandemic, sourcing paper and that kind of thing to print new books actually became really a challenge because all of the supply lines got disrupted by, just everything that went wrong during the pandemic. And publishing is still kind of recovering from that. So I've seen even, when I wrote my first novel, everybody said, oh, a novel is 100,000 words. And now everybody's saying a novel is 80,000 words. And it's partly because our attention spans have shifted to the streaming age and the social media age, but also because it's just harder to get paper and it's more expensive to get books made. So publishers are always thinking about the bottom line. But I kind of love this. I love that we have an old form that's kind of making a comeback.
Oh, yeah. And then you can write are you going to write some more novellas?
Oh, I don't know. I'd be game. I had so much fun with this. And I'd be delighted to try it again.
The plus with that is that you write another novella, you go on another tour. So easy. She's only going to 25 places in America and then a few somewhere else, other countries. And you do that with the next 3 novellas. And then you put them together in a book and you do a tour with us.
Oh.
It's so much fun.
I think if I said that to my publisher, they would fire me immediately.
No. You have been studying at King's College, right? When did you graduate? Or is it graduating? Is that what you do there?
Yeah. I did my master's in Shakespeare studies at King's College and Shakespeare's Globe, and that was 2015 to 2017. I was over there, so I basically came back just in time for us to kind of get Villains off the ground. I was revising that while I was in my master's program, and then because I'm a glutton for punishment, I decided to go get a PhD. So I spent the next 7 years doing that, and I just finished my doctorate in May of 23.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Don't applaud that. I should have dropped out.
Take those applause back.
Well, my PhD cohort jokingly, not so jokingly, calls me Dr. Don't Do It. The joke is that I spent 7 years getting a PhD so I can spend the rest of my life telling people not to get a PhD. So if you need to be talked out of that, come see me after class. I will give you all the reasons.
So you wrote that your thesis explores intersections. This is the stuff that you didn't want to say, but you put it out there. Explores intersections of literature, science, and medicine with a focus on madness and mood disorder on the early English stage. The less stuffy version, she says, I wrote my dissertation about crazy people in Shakespeare's plays. So the science and medicine that you wrote about and learned about in this process, did you use any of that in this book? You did, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of it. You can take the girl out of the academy, but you can't.
Do they say that? I don't think they say that.
I'm saying it. Well, that's the funny thing about doing a PhD and then getting to the other side and being like, oh, there's no job for me, is you still spent 7 years of your life completely immersed in this really niche subfield. And then what do you do with that afterwards? And in my case, it's just kind of, it's colored so much of my life for the last decade that it would be really difficult to kind of like turn that off. And one thing that part of my PhD was teaching, is that's kind of how you survive in a PhD program, is you get a stipend for teaching. So I spent 7 years teaching at the University of Maryland. And because it's shockingly difficult to get undergrads to sign up for Shakespeare classes, I ended up teaching a lot of random things, including a class with the worst title that has ever been devised. It was called Literature of Science and Technology Since 1800, which takes an entire semester just to say. It was a de facto science fiction class. Yeah. And when I got that assignment, I was like, I'm not qualified to teach this. Guess I'll learn a whole new field in the next 3 weeks. And was really surprised, one, by how much I enjoyed it, because I had never really had a strong interest in science fiction before that class, and was also very surprised by a lot of the students that I had in that class were students who were STEM majors, who were kind of trying to get their like one humanities requirement out of the way, because apparently you can get a whole education in the humanities in one class. And I was sort of frightened by how many of them were seniors and about to graduate and go work in like biomedical engineering. And no one had ever asked them really major ethical questions about research and technology and the kind of stuff that they're working on. And literature turned out to be a really great way to do that. Taking a bunch of students who have just been in biology classes or chemistry classes for 4 years and then making them read something like Cat's Cradle puts a whole bunch of different light bulbs on. And that was just really rewarding and inspiring. And at the same time, I'd found myself in this interesting camp of the medical humanities where I was looking at the history of science and technology and literature kind of side by side. So when I started writing Graveyard Shift, I was thinking a lot about this tension between the humanities and sciences and how they sometimes get pitted against each other in a collegiate environment. Because so often the humanities are like fighting to look more like the sciences, because that's how you get funding, is to demonstrate that your research has like quantifiable results, which is really hard to do when you're writing about like Shakespeare, just to use a personal example. Like what math do you apply to that to be like, this is the quantifiable yield of this project? So I was interested in the tension between these two fields, because what I was seeing was that instead of pitting these things against each other, we actually really need to put them in conversation. Right. Because I was seeing students who were STEM majors encountering questions like, when does a tool become a weapon and who is responsible for that for the first time in an English class in a novel about Kurt Vonnegut when they're about to go out into the workforce. So that was something I was thinking a lot about when I was writing Graveyard Shift, and partly because, my undergraduate experience was at UNC, where I was a theater major and an English major with a creative writing minor, but it's, the kind of big things here are medicine and basketball. And when you're not doing one of those two things, it's kind of difficult to sort of like carve out a niche for yourself. So that played into all of this in a very real way. And that's when it all kind of landed in the cemetery. I was also thinking about a graveyard as a place where those two things collide, because a graveyard is a place where we encounter human mortality from both a kind of humanistic and a sort of scientific perspective. Because you're thinking necessarily about, A, biologically, what happens to my body after I die, and B, how are people going to remember me after I die? Because those are two very different questions, but they're all kind of bound together in that environment.
Yeah. But they're not burying a person.
No.
Yeah. in this, and I don't know how much to give away. I think I should probably just stop right there, right? Not burying a person. So this just is really skimming the surface of all the things that you do and all your interests that you have. Music is, I'm assuming, always has been something that you've been into.
Yeah.
And vinyl.
Mm-hmm.
You love vinyl. I saw
I do.
High Fidelity, the movie the other day. Have you
Yeah.
seen it in a long time? It holds up.
It does.
It really does.
And have you seen the reboot? They did a TV show
Yes.
recently. Oh, it's delightful.
With the daughter of the woman who was in the movie.
Yes.
What was her name?
Zoe Kravitz?
Yeah.
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 And the best cameo that Debbie Harry has done in years.
Yeah. But that didn't hurry it up.
I know, and I was so sad because I really liked it.
Yeah. So come back for some more TV reviews. No, so vinyl. Now, I love talking to people that love vinyl, and I want to know why, because you can tell them one reason why we're talking about this. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah, so this novella is happening between If We Were Villains, which actually came out like a really long time ago, and my next full-length novel is coming out in fall of 2025 from Simon & Schuster, and it's called Hot Wax. And it is all about a concert tour gone terribly, terribly wrong in the summer of 1989. So that's actually what I was already writing when my publisher approached me about Graveyard Shift.
Right.
So I've been working on these two things at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is your passion for vinyl? I mean, it's not part of your deep past as it is mine.
Well, it is a little bit because so my dad grew up in Los Angeles and was there in the 70s, which was kind of like the perfect time to be in Los Angeles if you were into music. Like the first concert that my dad went to was he went to go see Zeppelin at the Forum in 1972, and I am sick with envy about that to this day. But when I was about 9, my dad came into my room and dropped a pile of CDs on my bed and said, "Educate yourself." And from that point, it was just kind of all over. But I really developed a love for vinyl as an aesthetic object in addition to as a way to listen to music because, you know, this is such a cliche to even say this, but it really actually is better sound quality. Not if you're listening to it on like a $50 Crosley that you bought from Urban Outfitters, like that's not. If you have a quality sound system that is like set up in the right way, vinyl does sound different. Vinyl is like, I saw someone, I think it was Simon Reynolds, has this great book called Retromania, where he talks about, you know, how media kind of comes back around. And he makes this great comparison where he talks about how vinyl is like fresh squeezed orange juice and like streaming is like from concentrate. Because the physical object, the smaller you have to make it, the more data you have to lose. And you don't even realize that if you grow up like listening to MP3s and streaming. Whereas like if you take a song that you know really well, that you've only ever heard on streaming, and then you listen to it on vinyl on a quality system, there are all these dimensions and this spatiality to the music that you completely don't even hear in another format. So that's one part of it, because I'm just an audiophile in general. But the other part of it is I really like the analog object of the record, because the cover art is so important, and the liner notes, like I miss liner notes. We don't get that anymore on Spotify. And as a person who's like a book person, that's also a kind of antiquated art object.
Yeah.
So I think it's also just like I appreciate the object itself and having a tactile relationship with it.
It's a piece of art, like a book. It's like a real book.
Yeah.
You know, that's what you want out in the world, something beautiful. And also, the same thing happens, I think, with vinyl that happens with books. I mean, you look at this book that I've been reading, and it's like, oh, you've been really hurting the book. I haven't been. This is good.
It's love.
This is love.
It's been love.
This is love. I'm just sorry there's not a coffee stain on it.
There's time.
There's time, right?
There's time.
When I look it over again. But LP is very similar to this in that there are songs, and I can't think of the songs. I think it might be Honky Chateau, that Honky Cat. There's a skip.
Yes.
In that from way back that I would always listen through. Then when I hear it now on the radio or streaming, I always hear that skip, and the skip that's not there doesn't
They've
sound
scrubbed
real.
it out. It's not the same.
It's not the same.
Well, it's even like the way that music was recorded when vinyl was the primary medium was completely different. Like, music that was recorded before click tracks is so interesting.
Right.
Because when you don't have a machine keeping time for you, like Zeppelin is my touch point for everything. Like if you go back and listen to a song like Rock and Roll, part of what makes it so dynamic is the fact that it actually speeds up. Because the musicians are just like so like getting off on their own whatever they're doing that they can't help kind of going faster and faster and faster, and they're all doing it together, and it's totally organic and it's completely magical. And had you done that with a click track and a drum machine, it never would have happened in the same way, and you lose that just that bottled lightning that you can't get any other way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's really exciting. That you're, I love how you put your passions into your work. Obviously, that's all we have. But getting, claiming them, that's what gives the books, I think, their lifeblood, right?
Yeah.
Their flesh and blood, really, because you are so much a part of that. I do want to get the crowd involved because I know that there are a lot of questions about you that they want to have answered, very personal questions. But because I know that I can't go over everything they're interested in. So let's open up the floor and have a conversation with Ms. Rita.
And this is the part where I tell you, just to encourage audience participation, because again, used to be a teacher, I have prizes. So, how this works is, whoever asks my favorite question, and it might just be a question I've never heard before, or just a question I really love to answer, you get a prize.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where do you get your shoes?
Oh, these, well, I feel like you'll appreciate this, and since we were just talking about music, I, last year, went to a Studio 54 themed New Year's party. And I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of what the waiters at Studio 54 used to wear. Google it, because it's great. It was like little red satin hot pants and tank tops and little white sneakers. And I buy a lot of vintage as well, because as you can tell, I just like old things. So I have a lot of vintage, like satin athletic shorts, and I went, oh, I can make a costume out of that. I just have to get the shoes. So that's where these came
That's
from.
where they are?
Yeah.
Do you think that's the best question so far? Anybody else? I'll let you.
Oh, okay. Well, I saw you first, so.
I'm still formulating an actual serious question. I have the beginnings, but I have a less serious question.
Doesn't have to be serious?
It's not music, so it's still very serious. So we had vinyls, we had streaming. In the middle, I would say, is CDs.
Yes.
How do we feel those CDs?
CDs are sort of like the ugly stepchild of the music business. Oh, no, I'm not saying that from a personal perspective. That's just like kind of how, because the thing about CDs is they were kind of a middle ground, and the audio quality of CDs is better than streaming, because again, the smaller you have to make it, like the worse the quality gets. And for a long time, I drove a very sexy 2012 Honda that did not have any version of Bluetooth. There was no way to pair a phone with this car. I had a disc changer. And I do a lot of driving. I usually drive from East Coast to West Coast like twice a year. And there's a 6-disc changer. CDs are dirt cheap. And when you're a graduate student and you're really broke, that matters. So I have actually a huge library of CDs, because for a long time I was doing these road trips, and just that was the only audio I had, was either the radio or CDs. And whoever designed that car deserves a lot of credit, because 6 CDs is just about how long it takes for me to run out of gas in that car. So it's like I would get to a gas station, I would stop, I would gas up, and the disc changer was in the trunk, by the way, not on the dashboard. So it was like I would do this weird like Chinese fire drill where I would like put the pump in the fuel pipe and run around to the back and like switch all the CDs out in the trunk, and then drive for 6 more CDs, and then I have to stop for gas again. So I think CDs have their place, and I think CDs are maybe going to make a comeback now that all the like 2000s nostalgia is coming back around. which is also the place where I tell you don't ever pluck your eyebrows because that was a thing in the early aughts. Don't do it. They'll never come back. It's not worth it. Don't buy low-rise jeans. Also not worth it. But if CDs came back, I would be okay with that. Because vinyl's heavy. Vinyl's heavy and CDs are not. Vinyl also melts. So like if you're going to go on a road trip through Death Valley, don't take your vinyl. Pink hair, I saw you second, and then we'll...
Okay. So when you were writing and editing your first novel, and now you have like this novella coming out and your second book coming out next year, did you ever feel pressure from your publisher to like put out the next one, like be productive, and like if so, like how did you push back against that and focus on your studies?
Oh man. Well, it was a little bit yes and a little bit no, because what you have to understand about the timeline for Villains is that, so I wrote Villains in 2014, that's fully 10 years ago, when I was a senior in college, which is not a thing you should do. No one should write a book at 22, it's too young.
Yeah, Victoria.
If you've done that, ignore me.
She might have done that.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry.
Still good advice. I think still good advice.
Yeah, there's some things that just like, it's better for those to be youthful pursuits that don't see the light of day. And
I don't think you should write one until you're 38, which is what I did.
I'm almost 38, and I'm still sort of wondering if I should wait. But, so when Villains first came out, it actually really didn't do well. And that's actually very normal. It's kind of a dirty little secret of the publishing industry that most books fail. Most books don't earn out. Most authors who publish a book never publish another one, because if you do publish a book and your sales aren't good, it is impossible to get published again, which is exactly what happened to me. When Villains came out, it didn't do well. It disappeared from bookstores pretty much instantly. And every book we wrote after that died on sub. We had a lot of editors who said to us, oh, we like this, but we can't convince the publisher because the numbers just aren't there. And that's a heartbreaking thing to hear when you're a creative and you've like put all your eggs in that basket and you're like, this is my debut, this is going to be the start of my career. And then you're like, oh no, this is actually the end of my career, is what's happening here. So that was what I was hearing a lot of. And I was like 25 at the time. And that was kind of heartbreaking. And I did kind of a hard pivot and went, okay, I guess I'm going to go to academia because that's a less punishing thing to do. I don't know. Things you do when you're 23 that seem like a good idea. And then some very strange kind of like world historic circumstances conspired in our favor, and Villains did start to sell, but not until like 4 years after it had come out. So it was this very strange thing where for the first kind of 3-4 years after Villains came out, I couldn't get anyone to give me the time of day in publishing. And then when I was kind of coming up on the end of my PhD, suddenly everybody was going, where is the next novel? Because now it's selling and now we want another one. And I basically told everyone, I'm in the dissertation oubliette. I can't do anything until this is done. And then, let's see, I finished my PhD in May of 23, and my publisher called me about, would you do a novella in June? So at that point, I had already gone back to trying to write the next novel because my agent was like, the numbers are good right now. We should try and take advantage of this momentum. And so Hot Wax, which will be coming out next year, was actually the first book I wrote after Villains. So I wrote the first version of this book like 7 years ago. I actually remember telling Daniel about it when we did an event for Villains. We talked about like, oh, I'm writing this crazy like road trip concert tour novel. Which no one wanted to buy until recently. And I've now completely rewritten it from the top down like 4 or 5 times. But there was a lot of pressure from readers and from my publisher where everyone kind of went, but we just want Villains Part 2, which is not what I wanted to do, because I was like, that was 10 years ago. I was a different person. The dark academia thing hadn't happened. Like when I wrote Villains, dark academia didn't exist. You could not buy a dark academia themed candle on Instagram in the year before 2014. We called it a campus novel because it was still a thing. Like a campus novel was a thing even before Donna Tartt. And so when the numbers were there and I was ready to go out on sub with another book, we got a lot of feedback that was like, okay, but how can we make this more like Villains? And I kept saying, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And we actually lost a lot of editors because of that. We had a bunch of people who said, like, actually, no, we don't want this unless it can be more like the thing that we know is already selling. I held out just because I'm stubborn, and I had gone a really long time without having any success in publishing, that I was like, I don't need that to live. Like, I'm going to hold out for the thing that creatively I really want to do. And eventually that paid off, and I got really lucky, and I found an editor who said to me, I want to be your publisher for a really long time, and all I care about is that it feels like an ML Rio book. And I was like, well, I wrote it, so even if it's not Villains Part 2, it is going to hopefully feel like an ML Rio book. So what I would say is, just as tough a decision as it has been many times to kind of hold on to my artistic integrity, I've never regretted doing that, even when it's meant that I was really, really broke for a really long time. Because I was really broke for a really long time. Like, I was in the car today, my editor, I'm driving myself to this entire tour, mostly because I just love road trips, and also because that was the only way my publisher was, like, down. And my editor actually called me in the car, which I thought she'd butt dialed me, because normally we do everything on email, and then she called again, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe it's intentional. And I picked up the phone, and she told me that we just found out that we are on the indie bestseller list this week, which is really exciting. It's so cool to learn that and be here in this great indie bookstore in the town that I was living in when I wrote If We Were Villains. But I also got that phone call when I was sitting right next to a parking lot where I once cried because I didn't have enough money for groceries while I was, like, writing Villains and working at Barnes & Noble and 4 other jobs at the same time. So it's tough. Like, it's gonna be tough to stick to your guns about the stuff that's important to you, but at the end of the day, you're the one who has to get up and talk about it, and you're the one whose name is gonna be on it. So even when it's hard, like, I think listen to your gut instincts about your art, because you're the artist, and you're gonna feel a lot of pressure from the outside. But, you know, everybody who's gonna try and make you into a version of something that's not really authentic to what you're doing, it's really hard to fake that in work. And you're gonna end up, you know, what's the Oscar Wilde quote about, it's always better to be a first-rate version of yourself rather than a second-rate version of someone else. So I think that is really true for art, as tough as that decision can be to make when somebody is, you know, dangling a carrot of publication or money or whatever it is. That was a very circuitous answer to a very concise question. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask about some insight about your experience in writing a novella versus how you wrote Villains, because, like, I'm looking at it, Villains, you know, had, like, the ensemble cast of 5 characters, so clearly you feel like, you said that you were an ensemble writer, so you carry over some similarities between the 2 books. But I was just curious on, was it a different experience working under those 30,000? You're an overwriter. Like, how did you approach that change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of it was just sort of circumstantial. I didn't really have a choice, but I had to write differently because I was also working on Hot Wax at the same time. I was already kind of neck deep in that draft. And publishing is very seasonal, where, like, August is a total dead zone. Everyone is out to lunch. You can't get anything from anyone in August, like, don't even bother. And then you have this absolute feeding frenzy in the fall of September, October, November, because that's when all the big book releases happen. That's when all the big sales happen. And then in the holidays, everyone is out to lunch again for all of December. So my agent and I knew that we had this very narrow window in, like, late November, early December to get this book out on sub with new editors. Otherwise, we were just going to get ghosted by everyone. So I was writing really feverishly to that deadline, and then Flatiron called and said, hey, how about doing a novella at the same time? And I was like, yeah, that seems like a smart, sure. So what I did basically was I said, yes, I will write that novella, and then I didn't touch it for a bunch of months because I needed to finish Hot Wax. And the way that I write is I'm a very thorough outliner. I'm not a pantser at all. I'm weirdly type A for a creative. I don't know about you, but, like, I need to have a plan or nothing's going to happen. So while I was working on Hot Wax, I was kind of, like, mucking around in the discovery space of Graveyard Shift without actually putting anything on paper. So I was listening to a lot of music, making a lot of pin boards, thinking about these characters and kind of playing with the idea of where could this go. And then in late November, we went on sub with Hot Wax, and I turned around and I wrote Graveyard Shift in 3 weeks. Wow. Because that was the time that I had. Originally, they told me I could have until February, and then they came back and said, just kidding, can we have it in December? And I was like, sure. And so that was sort of an outside circumstance that forced me to write the book really, really quickly. But in a certain way, it was kind of like life imitating art, in that I knew it was going to have to be a very breakneck pace for the book itself, because I had a lot I wanted to do with 5 characters in a very short space. So writing it that quickly, I think actually forced me to really focus on the pacing and not write anything extraneous. So I actually, and I knew that I had that 30,000 word upper limit, whereas when you're writing a full-length novel, you have a little more room to move. And it's often not until you get to a production draft that the editor is like, we really want to cap this at 110,000 words or whatever it is. I think the version of Villains that I submitted was like 117,000 words. My publisher said we'd really like it to be 110 or less. So we ended up cutting 9,000 words and also adding a bunch of stuff. So, yeah, it was something I'd never done before, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go, but I think it worked out okay, and I really like the way it turned out, and it does feel very, very quick, but that was kind of the idea, and I went into it knowing that I had that limitation. I had a very funny conversation with my partner at one point. I was up very late at night, typing feverishly in the dark, and he kind of knocked on the door and said, like, hey, are you doing okay? Like, what's going on in there? And I was very stressed out about this deadline, and God bless him, he was saying something like, oh no, I know you're stressed now, but like it's gonna be it's like you're gonna do such good work and it's gonna be a masterpiece. And I said to him, I was like, I'm not trying to write a masterpiece, I'm trying to write an episode of Scooby-Doo. And that was kind of the model that I took, and I just went, I'm gonna write the best damn episode of Scooby-Doo that I can come up with. So I think there is something to be said for recognizing the limitations of your form, because that can actually be really freeing when you're like, okay, I have a limited set of circumstances to work with. Like, what can I do with those constraints?
Ruh-roh.
Yeah. Jinkies. Yeah, right here.
So, staying true to your integrity, how with going into like audiobooks, and also like there was at one point talks of Villains maybe.
There was what?
There was some rumor of Villains maybe being picked up into TV land.
Oh, yeah.
Point. Like, how do you? And I know you can speak to this as well about maintaining your like creative work when it like how much do you have once it leaves and goes off into movie, musical?
Well, I'm really comfortable when you talk about integrity. It's just something that I'm not as familiar with.
Oh God, I'm thinking of, there's a line from an Arctic Monkey song, which is, I'm launching my new fragrance called Integrity. I'm selling the fact that I can't be bought. Which that line lives in my head rent free. Well, you can maybe speak to this more than I can, because, so Villains has been optioned for film. Yeah. Which just means that it's just that, it's an option. Yeah. Like, it could happen. But I will say, that was also a place where I stuck to my guns in a way that is not super normal, because I said, it was interesting. I had a lot of the conversations with these Hollywood people who were clearly very not used to a writer being like, I'm less concerned about the money than I am about this getting done right. Good. And they actually let me put some veto clauses in our contract, which I did not realize was not a done thing until later. Some people at my agency were emailing my agent going, how the hell did you get these clauses? Because if authors knew we could do this, this would never be the same. And I genuinely just didn't know you weren't allowed to do that. So I was like, here are my rules for if this is going to get made. So one thing I will say, though, is as the author, you have so much less control than readers think you do. For instance, cover art. The number of questions I've had to field from readers about, like, why did you do X, Y, and Z about the cover? And I have to be like, sometimes I don't even see the cover art until it is out in the world. Like, our Brazilian publisher just posted a very cool reel of the cover art for Graveyard Shift, and I was like, I've literally never seen that. Instagram is my first time seeing that. So as the author, you get a lot less creative control than you think. And you have to just sort of make peace with that, which is why it's really important when you're in the phase of like talking to an agent or talking to editors, asking questions like, how do you imagine presenting this? Like, who do you think the sister books are? What are the comp titles? The single best piece of advice I ever got about publishing was from Chris Paris-Lamb, who's also a UNC alum, and he's an agent now at FSG. And when I was getting ready to query with villains, I was just asking him about the process of finding an agent, and he said, who do you want talking about your book when you're not in the room? Because that's your agent's job. And that was the best piece of advice I ever got about it. And so I've kind of carried that with me through everything that I do, is when I talk to people that I'm going to collaborate with, is this someone I would be comfortable with them talking about my book when I'm not in the room? Because you do have to relinquish some creative control, but you can be judicious about who you work with and where your lines in the sand are. But Daniel, I'd love to hear you talk about that, because you've had some things actually adapted for stage and for screen. And what's your experience with that been like?
Well, the screenwriter of Big Fish said, and not in reference to me, but we were talking about the relationship between screenwriters and authors in general, and we thought that most screenwriters is the best author to work with is a dead author. They hate authors. They're taking your book
Mm-hmm.
and they're making a movie out of it, and if you're not familiar with the relationship or the idea of how different an animal movie can be, that you might. I mean, there have been authors that really insinuate themselves into the production of it. From the outset, I decided I wasn't going to say or do almost anything, because I'd never seen a script before. I didn't know how it was done. The first script I read was the one for Big Fish, and the screenwriter sent me all his drafts. It was really great. He was just a really sweet guy, and I loved it. I think that was a problem as far as this conversation goes, because I thought he did a great job. I said, the only thing I said was, the father needs to swim more, because he turns into a fish. Oh, and I did say, shout out to UNC, he goes to some random school like in the Midwest. I said, why can't he just go to UNC?
Yeah. Why can't we all just go to UNC?
Let's make it UNC. They did not do that. Disappointing. But I relinquished, legally, of course, when they buy something, you generally, unless you have veto power to, what do you have veto power over?
Well, I was careful about that, because they were like, you might get a couple of things, you're not going to get all the things you want. And I also, I'm not a screenwriter.
Right.
And I shouldn't be a screenwriter, because I literally have not owned a TV in my adult life. I have never finished a TV series. I'm just bad with screen media. So I was like, that's terrifying. I can't write a script for anything. My sticking points were things like, I said things like, the series can't compromise the ending of the book, because it's very, very deliberate. And I was like, you can't change the ending, and you can't do any prequels, sequels, or spinoffs that change that ending. I also said things like, this one was really important to me. I said, don't whitewash this cast. You can make it more diverse, but not less. Don't make the queer characters straight. Don't make the people of color white. I feel very strongly about that. And then the other thing I said was, you need a qualified expert consulting on the Shakespeare. Right. Because there's so much Shakespeare in villains, and that is one of the hats I wear, as I am an academic. And film adaptations of Shakespeare tend to not be made by people who have any business making them. So I did put a clause in there that said, if this goes forward, you need to have a qualified expert consulting on the Shakespeare. And then they did exactly what I hoped they would do, which is they said, well, would you be willing to consult on the Shakespeare? And I said, for an additional fee per episode, of course. So it was things like that. Like, you have to pick your battles, and I recognize that someone who actually understands film and how it works is going to be a better person to write that script than I am. But there were some things that felt intrinsic to the integrity of the work that I was like, This is important, and I want this codified in legally binding language.
That's a really good idea. One more question.
Yes.
No.
Oh. I thought you had a question. Oh gosh, so many hands. I don't know where to go.
But you can also, talk to her and when you're in the signing.
That's true, yes. You can also ask me questions in the signing line. You, just because I'm looking at you. Yes.
Kind of what we were just talking about, but as a fellow Shakespeare, what are your favorite and also ones that you really hate adaptations?
Oh, adaptations. Oh gosh. I don't want to call out ones that I hate. That just feels mean.
I don't really like the kind of ones. That makes you feel
I don't. K-Bra is great for so many things, but yeah, I don't think those are the best adaptations generally. I will admit that I struggle with adaptations of Shakespeare for the reason I just mentioned, which is that they're often made by people who really shouldn't be making them, and they're often made for kind of the wrong reasons. Like, I remember watching the Julian Fellowes adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, and I was like, you've done some serious violence to the script for absolutely no reason, and there are parts of it that genuinely just make no sense now. Like, you've made cuts here that make the internal chronology of the play impossible, and I don't know why you would do that. But that doesn't mean there are no good adaptations. This is sort of a weird one, but if you've never seen the 2010 Patrick Stewart Macbeth, where he's Macbeth, but he's also Stalin, it's fabulous. It's my favorite version of The Witches that I've ever seen, and it's a really cool piece of film because it's kind of like halfway between a film and a play. There's a lot of scenes where you can't really tell where the playing space ends and where it begins, and it feels theatrical in that way, so I've taught that one. But the other one that I have to put a plug in for, it's not a straight adaptation. It is a very outdated but beloved Canadian TV show called Slings and Arrows. It's hard to find, but the library will probably have it. And it's not an adaptation, but it's one of the best depictions of a working theater company in all of its glorious dysfunction that I have ever seen. And it's also a lot of really famous actors, before they were famous. I think it was one of Rachel McAdams' first roles. So if you've never seen Slings and Arrows, it is an absolute delight, and I would love for everyone to go find that and watch a few episodes, because it's just great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.